When historians describe the year 1906 in San Francisco, they focus on the catastrophe above ground, the violent earthquake that struck at 5:12 a.m., the fires that consumed the city for 3 days, the devastation that left over 400 blocks in ruins. But the real story, the one that barely appeared in reconstruction reports, the one that even today sits buried in municipal footnotes, began below the surface. It started with a massive cleanup operation. Engineers were instructed to clear debris across the ruined city, remove rubble from collapsed buildings, and prepare the ground for San Francisco's ambitious reconstruction. As the nation watched the city rise from ashes, the goal was practical: stabilize the terrain, assess the damage, and determine whether the land could support the weight of a rebuilt metropolis. But the moment workers began digging through the destruction, something unexpected happened. They broke through layers that hadn't been exposed in decades. Beneath the rubble of 1906, deeper than anyone anticipated, the crews found tunnels and chambers that didn't match any known infrastructure. Their scale was immense, their construction was unusual, and the stonework didn't resemble anything in San Francisco's documented history. It didn't even resemble the Victorian-era construction that had supposedly defined the city. This wasn't mentioned in public reconstruction reports. It didn't make it into the newspapers covering the rebuilding effort. But in the internal notes of that year, a quiet phrase appears over and over again. Pre-existing tunnels, unexpected depth, origin unknown. The official story would later simplify all of this into old sewer lines, forgotten mining tunnels, or simply misidentified earthquake damage. Nothing unusual, nothing worth discussion. But the survey photographs from the time, the ones developed in dim municipal offices while San Francisco rebuilt, show something different. They show workers standing beside brick-lined passages built with precision far superior to anything in the city's official construction records. Tunnels wide enough to drive carriages through, yet absent from every map. Arched corridors fitted together so expertly that even in the grainy quality of early 1900s photography, the craftsmanship is unmistakable. Drainage systems carved into bedrock that don't appear in any city planning document. And the deeper they dug, the more the layers stopped looking like Victorian infrastructure, and more like infrastructure that had been built over, buried, and deliberately forgotten. At first, the cleanup teams tried to categorize everything in the simplest way possible. Old utility tunnels, abandoned mine shafts, natural fissures opened by the earthquake. But as notes accumulated and more passages were uncovered, the inconsistencies multiplied. Why were some of the tunnels built to a scale far larger than anything San Francisco needed in the 1800s? Why were certain sections lined with bricks so precisely laid that modern engineers still can't explain the technique? Why did some corridors extend beneath areas that were supposedly virgin hillside before American settlement? And the question that troubled even the most traditional city planners: why were these deeper tunnels so elaborate? The reconstruction required precise surveys of ground stability. Yet the subterranean infrastructure beneath parts of downtown North Beach and the financial district appeared built for a city far larger and far older than the San Francisco of public record. Cleanup teams quietly admitted among themselves that the depth and scale didn't line up with any construction timeline they knew. And although none of them were using terms like hidden history, they were acknowledging something just as unsettling. Someone had built beneath this land before. Not simple tunnels, not primitive mine shafts, a network. As the documentation increased, so did the silence. Reports became shorter, descriptions became vague, photographs stopped showing the full extent of the passages. And then the excavation zones were hastily sealed again, in late 1906 and early 1907, filled with rubble from the earthquake, covered with new construction, and much of what was exposed was returned to darkness. Only fragments remain: notes, a handful of photographs, and the quiet testimonies of city workers who saw the tunnels before some sections were permanently closed. But even from what survives, a pattern becomes visible. Passages too elaborate for San Francisco's known history. Brickwork too advanced for the accepted timeline. Construction methods that look inherited, infrastructure that seems to belong to a different era of building entirely. When the reconstruction teams moved past the first recognizable layers beneath the ruined city, the expectations were simple. They believed they would find earthquake damage, perhaps some old basement foundations, and scattered remnants from early gold rush construction. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary. But within weeks that assumption collapsed, because instead of a neat sequence of collapsed buildings and natural bedrock, the teams uncovered a stack of infrastructure layers that didn't behave the way layers of a normal city are supposed to behave. The first anomaly was alignment. Each layer, post-earthquake, pre-earthquake Victorian, and whatever lay beneath, seemed to follow the same grid, the same orientation, the same geometric pattern. Different eras shouldn't do that. Different city planners, different construction companies, different decades. They don't build in perfect alignment with infrastructure buried meters below them. Yet beneath San Francisco, they did. Tunnels from one era ran directly above tunnels from another. Passages lined up with passages buried far below them. Drainage systems shared the same trajectory even when separated by unknown decades or centuries. It was as if every group that ever built on this soil was following an original city plan, one that no longer existed in any archive. As the workers dug deeper, the layers became stranger. Beneath the expected Victorian-era brick and timber, they began encountering stonework that looked nothing like 19th century construction. Much larger passages, much tighter brickwork, systems that seemed too mathematically precise for anything in San Francisco's documented timeline. Some tunnels appeared almost overbuilt, perfectly arched chambers with flawless curvature, crafted with a precision that didn't match the construction methods of Gold Rush-era California. And then came the discovery that puzzled even the most experienced engineers. Entire sections of the deepest tunnels were filled with hardened mud and sediment, packed so densely it took days to excavate. Layer upon layer of compressed earth, as if these passages had been deliberately buried or had been submerged and filled naturally over time. Yet there is no historical record of San Francisco experiencing flooding severe enough to fill underground tunnels to this depth. No maps showing ancient waterways beneath these specific points. Nothing that explains why large sections of the deepest infrastructure look like they had been intentionally entombed beneath layers of mud and debris. Survey photographs taken in 1906 and 1907 show this clearly. Workers standing beside passages so large that men look small in comparison. Brickwork laid so precisely that even today engineers study the archival images in disbelief. Arches and joints that resemble infrastructure far older and far more sophisticated than anything Gold Rush San Francisco is credited with. But the most unsettling detail was not what appeared in the photographs. It was what didn't appear in the archives. The official reconstruction reports written in the years after the earthquake barely mention these features. Some drawings omit the deepest tunnels entirely. Certain layers of infrastructure are summarized with vague terms like pre-existing utilities or earlier construction, even though the photographs show they were far more complex than that. The silence is hard to miss. Because if these deeper layers truly belong to known historical periods, why weren't they described in detail? Why weren't the unusual construction techniques documented thoroughly? Why were the photographs scattered across city archives instead of gathered into a comprehensive municipal report? Even some of the brickwork raised questions. Joints too tight, surfaces too smooth, patterns too uniform, marks that look less like hand-laid brick and more like mass-produced precision construction. Construction that, according to the conventional timeline, didn't exist when those tunnels were supposedly built. What the reconstruction teams uncovered was infrastructure that didn't match Gold Rush construction, didn't match Victorian engineering, and didn't even match itself across different depths. Instead, it formed a strange architectural language, one that seemed to come from multiple eras, yet somehow remained unified, aligned, and impossibly sophisticated. The first shock came with the chambers themselves. These weren't crude mining tunnels or narrow utility passages. They were perfectly vaulted spaces, rooms shaped with exact proportions, arches that held their curve flawlessly across decades, and brick vaults laid out with coherence, almost like the remnants of a master infrastructure plan that no longer exists in any archive. Some chambers were sealed completely, packed with compressed mud so dense that workers thought they had hit solid bedrock. But once opened, they revealed interiors that looked untouched since the day they were closed. Smooth walls, fitted brick, and construction patterns that raised more questions than answers. And then came the feature that still puzzles researchers today: the giant circular access shafts. Officially, they were later labelled as old wells or natural sinkholes, but nothing about them fits typical well design or geological formation. These were too symmetrical, too deep, and too perfectly cylindrical, as if they were cut with tools capable of maintaining flawless roundness for dozens of meters down. Some shafts were wide enough for multiple workers to descend side by side. Others narrowed gradually, almost like ventilation systems or mechanical access points for machinery. Workers from 1906 described them in private correspondence as engineered vertical passages, not wells, but structures with a deliberate purpose, though no one could say what that purpose might have been. Another anomaly appeared in the placement of certain support structures. These were not simply holding up the streets above. Many were positioned in ways that made no engineering sense for Victorian San Francisco. Massive brick pillars supporting sections that seemed to need no reinforcement, foundation walls extending far beyond the footprint of any documented building above them. It created an uncomfortable possibility. The city above ground may not simply rest on natural bedrock. It may sit on something much larger, an infrastructure whose extent was never recorded, never mapped, and never explained in the official history of San Francisco. The deeper the workers dug, the stranger the findings became. Brick tunnels appeared with perfectly straight walls. Some surfaces were glazed, smooth, almost reflective. Others showed precision-cut passages so uniform that modern construction engineers still debate what methods could have produced them. But the discovery that caused the most confusion was the presence of metal rails embedded in the floors of tunnels that supposedly predated any rail system in San Francisco. Some rails looked corroded, rusted, or fused to the brick, yet they were found in layers supposedly older than the city's first streetcar lines. The official explanation offered later: abandoned mining cart tracks, forgotten industrial remnants. But that does not explain why the rails appear in tunnels beneath areas that were never documented as mining sites, and why they run in organized patterns, not randomly placed, but aligned like the infrastructure of a transit system that was never officially built. Soon after these discoveries, something unusual began happening. Tunnels were sealed again, passages were filled, deep sections of the sites were cut off from further exploration. Some of this was officially labelled as structural safety concerns necessary to prevent collapses during reconstruction. But the decisions about which tunnels to seal first and which areas to bury permanently raised quiet questions among observers, because the passages that were closed immediately were always the ones that challenged the official timeline the most. The perfectly vaulted chambers, the massive circular shafts, the unexplained rail systems, the elaborate brick corridors that seemed to continue far beyond the excavation zone. These tunnels were perhaps the most mysterious find of all. They weren't random passages. They were part of an organized network, a grid of infrastructure that looked less like improvised mining tunnels and more like a planned city beneath the city. Aligned, measured, systematic, as if they once connected to a much larger underground system, one that extended beneath San Francisco long before any city we acknowledge ever existed on the surface. And yet, almost as soon as they were uncovered, many were sealed again. Their entrances blocked, their purpose unexplored, their existence quietly removed from subsequent city maps. When you study the final months of the 1906 reconstruction excavations, something becomes impossible to ignore. The projects didn't end naturally. They were stopped, not completed, not concluded, stopped. The deeper the cleanup teams went, the more the tone of their notes changed. Early entries were matter-of-fact, almost routine. But by mid-1907, the language becomes cautious, vague, and strangely incomplete, as if someone else suddenly controlled what could be written down. And this is where the final mystery begins, because the last tunnels they opened beneath San Francisco weren't ordinary. They weren't Victorian utilities, they weren't gold rush remnants, they weren't even identifiable, they were something else entirely. Multiple reports, the few that survived, described brickwork that suddenly shifted from the familiar to the unexplainable. Walls with joints so tight you couldn't slide paper between them. Vaulted ceilings shaped with precision that pre-modern San Francisco was never supposed to have. Foundation systems built for loads far heavier than anything documented above them, and corridors that extended beyond the excavation zone, disappearing beneath modern buildings into unexplored darkness. But here's the part that always gets buried. The most elaborate tunnels were the ones that were filled in first. Workers described sealing entire passages, blocking entrances, packing earthquake rubble into spaces that had just been uncovered. It wasn't gradual, it was immediate. The official explanation: earthquake damage, safety concerns, reconstruction priorities. But if it was only about safety, why were the oldest, cleanest, most structurally sound tunnels the ones sealed first? And why were the most damaged sections left exposed for documentation? It doesn't make sense unless those deeper layers posed a different kind of threat. Not a physical one, a historical one. Because if the infrastructure beneath San Francisco truly showed construction techniques beyond gold rush capability, and if some of those passages didn't match any known city plan at all, then the entire accepted story of San Francisco's founding begins to collapse. Imagine what it would mean if modern San Francisco were built on top of something far older, something massive, something engineered, something we didn't build. Imagine what it means if the mud-filled tunnels weren't natural flooding, but deliberate attempts by later peoples to hide or repurpose what came before. And maybe that is why the 1906 discoveries were quietly reburied, not to protect the sites, but to protect the narrative. The surviving photographs tell their own story. Workers standing next to passages that look almost industrial, arches that resemble modern engineering, drainage systems too sophisticated for their supposed age. These aren't the kinds of discoveries historians like to explain. They're the kinds they prefer not to talk about at all. And that brings us to the final question. Why was the deepest evidence, the earliest infrastructure, the most advanced layers sealed away again? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The perfect brickwork was buried. The giant circular shafts were buried. The unexplained rail systems were buried. The elaborate vaulted chambers were buried. The organized tunnel networks were buried. And even parts of the photographic record vanished, almost as if the excavation had accidentally revealed a chapter of history that wasn't supposed to surface. A chapter older than the gold rush, older than American settlement, older than the narrative we were given. And for one brief moment in 1906, the earthquake opened the ground just enough to show it. But instead of studying it, they closed it again, sealed it, filled it, forgot it, or pretended to. Because if San Francisco stands on top of infrastructure built by a civilization we no longer acknowledge, then the real question is not what was discovered in 1906. It's what else lies beneath the cities of the world. What other tunnels, what other networks, what other layers were quietly reburied long before cameras existed? The 1906 excavation wasn't just earthquake cleanup. It was a glimpse, a brief accidental glimpse into a version of history we were never meant to see. Thanks for watching. And if you found this interesting, well, there are a lot more cities with stories like this. Maybe I'll see you in the next one.